All right, well, good morning. And on behalf of Washington Association of Wheat Growers Ammo Program, I'd like to welcome you today. I'm Katie Gilkey, the Outreach Coordinator here at WAG. We're excited to continue our 2025 Education Outreach Program and thank each of you for joining us for this timely and important discussion. For today's webinar, please keep your line muted and I will help with that. If I don't see that yours is muted, I'll mute it. And then if you have any questions, you're welcome to put those in the comments. And Jake said he's welcome to answer questions as he goes along. And then we can also have some Q&A at the end. And so if you want to just either way, whether you put it in the comments or wait till the end and we'll have some time. We are excited to welcome NAWG's Jake Westlin this morning. You may have seen him at past Tri-State Grain Grower Convention breakout sessions. He is the National Association of Wheat Growers Vice President of Policy and Communications, and he began with NAWG in 2019. Prior to NAWG, Jake had experience on Capitol Hill, from interning with the former U.S. Senator Conrad and being a legislative correspondent and legislative aide to former U.S. Senator Heitkamp. Westlin has brought fundamental understanding of the Hill to NAWG. From his time at Forbes Tate Partners as a research and policy analyst, he has extensive background in agriculture, public lands, as well as food and nutrition policy. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. Please help me welcome Jake Westlin.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here because I do have some slides for the group today. So just one moment to swap these around. All right, are you seeing the title one? And it looks right. It's not the presenter mode one. Perfect.
It's good.
Well, it's a pleasure to be before this group again to give an update on what's going on in Washington, D.C. But I'm going to start a little bit with reflecting on some of the highlights of 2018, the 118th Congress, to set the stage for what we have ahead of us as we continue to move into the calendar year and into the 119th Congress. So I did want to kind of highlight some of the high points from last year and the last Congress. We did see a lot of Farm Bill progress in the early part of 2024, where we got the Farm Food and National Security Act passed out of the House Agriculture Committee on a bipartisan manner. And that was a 5-year Farm Bill. And that had a lot of good provisions that NAWG supported that were included as part of that. It had, a meaningful investment in the farm safety net as it relates to, our Title I programs, ARC and PLC. So it had a statutory reference price increase for wheat, which was one of NAWG's requests. It also was doubling MAP and F&B funding, which was another one of NAWG's priorities. And it also looked at crop insurance and expanding some of that options and making it more affordable to producers, which was another NAWG priority. So there was a lot of good things that were included in that. But unfortunately, it stalled out. We didn't see any progress being made in the United States Senate, at least from a legislative standpoint, where we saw legislative text, but nothing was introduced. There was no committee markup. So those efforts ultimately withered on the vine, and we find ourselves again in a period where we are in a Farm Bill extension. And we'll talk a little bit about those dynamics as we continue with today's discussion. Another thing that NAWG was very active in last year, we had 2 dedicated Farm Bill fly-ins in 2024. We also had other Hill visits as well, which I kind of will encapsulate as part of our annual fly-ins that we have as part of our winter meeting, and also our National Wheat Improvement Committee research-focused fly-ins. And we also had a number of food aid visits as well in collaboration with U.S. Wheat Associates and the North American Millers Association. But the one I really wanted to draw the group's attention to was this first ever multi-commodity fly-in that we held in September, along with a handful of other national grower associations like corn growers, sorghum producers, cotton producers, the Peanut Federation. There was a wide variety of folks who were, before Capitol Hill talking about the need to get a farm bill done now. And not just any old farm bill, but the right farm bill that made a meaningful investment in the farm safety net because of the the conditions facing the egg economy right now, right? And you all know this. There's continued high input prices, and our and the prices for wheat and other commodities has fallen significantly since over the last few years, while those input prices remain sticky. So that fly-in ultimately, elevated that discussion about the need for producers across the countryside. But one of the things that we talked about is if we can't get this farm bill done this year, we really need to have economic assistance before the end of the year, period. And and we really drew a hard line with that as we got into December, where it was on and off again. Whether or not it was going to be included, it was really touch and go that week before Christmas. And it was in the package, it was out of the package, it might have sailed independently of the continuing resolution. It was back in, it was out, it was in again. Ultimately, it was in. And there was $10 billion in economic assistance that NAWG and these other grower associations were able to secure with the close collaboration with not only G.T. Thompson, but Senator Bozeman, the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, and others. I mean, Chairman Stabenow was also advocating for this, as was Ranking Member Scott on the House side. So there was a wide understanding in the ag community about the need to get this economic assistance included as part of a continuing resolution, absent getting the right farm bill done. And through your voices out in Washington, we really helped elevate that message because in this run-up, this was the second largest campaign that we've ever ran, and it was also one of the shortest campaigns that we ever ran from a grassroots advocacy perspective. And we had close to 600 unique grower participants across the country send letters into their lawmakers and tell them that you can't go home before Christmas without getting economic assistance passed that can be rolled out by USDA to help support producers during this period of economic uncertainty. So that was a really good way to kind of end the year to help get that enacted. We are still working with USDA to get that implemented, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue with today's discussion. And we just continued our efforts on wheat research, and also we saw developments at USDA APHIS on deregulating HB4 wheat, which is a genetically modified wheat out of Argentina, and we can talk about that later if there's interest too. But really, as we continue into this new year, this new Congress, there's been a fury of activity. So I'll kind of take a moment here just to kind of talk through what's going on right now. What's the atmosphere like inside the Beltway? Where do we kind of see things going in this immediate term as we kind of wade into the new year in this first part of the 119th Congress? So both the House and Senate, they're in session this week. The Senate right now is taking a procedural action on a Small Business Administration secretary. It's a former senator from Georgia, but just before lunch, well, it's lunch out here, but just before I had lunch, the Senate confirmed Brooke Rollins to lead USDA. So she'll be sworn in tomorrow morning. I'll be over at USDA for that swearing in party or reception. So we're looking forward to having people in place at these federal agencies who can make decisions on behalf of the administration, right? Because right now we have acting people in these positions and their career employees who have a solid understanding of what the needs are, but they're not really in a position to enact stuff on behalf of the president. So they're really just kind of placeholder folks who are there to keep things rolling, but not really endeavor on any new policy directives. So Brooke Rollins will start tomorrow as the Secretary of Agriculture. So we're looking forward to working with her, to work with her to get this economic and disaster assistance that was enacted at the end of last year rolled out. So nominations are really kind of what's going on the Senate side right now. I'm going to skip down too, but another thing that's really been in the vernacular this week is budget resolutions and what that means for border security, national defense, energy policy, as well as taxes, right? So the Senate Budget Committee, they took action earlier this week on their version of a 2025 budget resolution. The House Budget Committee right now, or earlier today, they are in the process of passing their own budget resolution out of committee. These two resolutions are different. They need to come together and harmonize those before they get put all the way forward. But those are needed to do a few different things. Adjust the debt ceiling, debt limit. Also, it paves the way for a reconciliation bill or bills to proceed forward, and those they're common tactics used by both sides, both on both parties. They utilize these as vehicles to enact major policy decisions that they feel are mandated. They have a mandate to execute, right? So under President Biden, you saw the Inflation Reduction Act. You also saw so that was using a reconciliation process. President Trump before had used this to enact the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2017, which is a legacy tax package that he got helped getting enacted. And then a notable one from President Obama, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. So that those are all things that have been done through the reconciliation process. And the conversation right now, I think, on Capitol Hill is whether or not they do one or two. There are dueling arguments for those, and we don't really need to get to that. That's something that the Republican conference will work out on its own. But a couple of things they want to do as part of that is enact more or get more resources for border security, bolster defense, take a more traditional path on energy policy related to drilling and fossil fuels, and on the tax side they also are interested in extending and or expanding many of the provisions that were included as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And I can talk a little bit more taxes later and talk about some of the activity that NAWG's been doing related to that. But that's how that current debate is unfolding right now in DC. A couple of the other things that we are tracking closely is potential Congressional Review Act bills that might get introduced and move. And the Congressional Review Act is kind of a look back to things that have happened in the last 6 or so months of a previous administration, where they might work to revert or roll back regulatory rules, guidelines, notices, stuff that it provides an opportunity to undo some of that regulatory action from the last few months. So they will likely do a look back on some things that the Biden administration put forward and mix those from a rulemaking standpoint, and then promulgate new regulations that would fall in line with this administration's priorities. Additionally, as we look a little bit further into the year, is federal funding. What that looks like beyond March 14th is a little bit unknown at present, but that's when the federal funds authorized to keep the lights on at federal agencies expire. So it's typically the federal government typically runs through the end of September. That's when we have the Farm Bill deadline, but the Congress has been notorious in recent years for just kicking the can down the road a little bit, incrementally, right? So they did it through, I believe it was the initial deadline was that early December timeframe, and then it was right before Christmas, and then now again it's March 14th. So a fairly common theme, but another thing that we are also watching and working closely on, and I'll touch more on it in a moment, but there has been an uptick in cadence on hearings related to the ag economy and how that might translate to a farm bill. And I have a slide on that in a few moments. But we're in the midst of President Trump's first 100 days. A lot of executive nominations and executive branch actions and policy priorities are in the process of being rolled out. But I included a few notable, secretary type positions or cabinet level positions that we'll be working more closely with. I mentioned Rollins already, but there's a few people who are second tier USDA folks who have been put forward. Ms. Rollins is the first one at USDA to make it through, but Richard Fordyce, he was FSA administrator in the past Trump administration. He'll be the FPAC lead. That was Robert Bonney, if you're trying to equate that to who it was up until the end of the Biden administration. Lee Zeldin of New York had been confirmed earlier this year to lead EPA. I think Lutnick is on deck after Kelly Loeffler, who's the SBA administrator, but Burgum and Kennedy. Oh, Kennedy was confirmed earlier this morning as well. Doug Burgum for Interior, and a handful of folks there. Yeah, and Tony has a good question on economic assistance. I will touch on that in just a minute, Tony. So that's an excellent question, and we'll get into that. Another thing that we're tracking closely is just like the tariff related action. We did see a executive order get put out a couple weeks ago, and there have been a trickle of other ones since then. But the first one really out the gate was this, America First trade policy, and there was also efforts to put tariffs on Canadian and Canadian imports and imports from Mexico. Those fortunately have been delayed. The implementation of those has been delayed at present as they continue to have ongoing discussions, but that's something that we're watching closely. But I did see ones earlier today about reciprocal ones. So if a country has like a 10% tariff on American goods and we have a lower one, they would implement like a parity policy. It basically would bring that one up, the US one up to 10% if a country has one with us like that as well. Other ones, there's reinstatement of the steel and aluminum tariffs that we also saw in the first Trump administration as well. A lot of those stayed on during the Biden administration, but there were waivers and exemptions to countries. A lot of them were closer allies, but those are being reverted by this administration as well. So that's something else that we're watching closely. So I mentioned it a moment ago that the House and Senate Agriculture Committees have been kicking off a hearing process as it relates to the state of the farm economy. And last week, President Felty, NAWG President Felty, in the orange tie on the screen, he was in Washington, D.C., and he testified on the second panel. And there's two panels. The first one was the Zippy Duvall, the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, was there along with the president of National Farmers Union, Rob LaRue. So that was the first panel there before a full Senate Agriculture Committee hearing. So this is the room where it was held. It's not the traditional Senate Ag Committee room if you're familiar with it, and if you're scratching your head. But because the second panel that Keith was on consisted of, I believe, 7 individuals from many of the major commodity associations. So like if you're wondering who else was on the dais, you had the leaders from National Sorghum Producers, Corn Growers, American Soybean Association, National Cotton Council, USA Rice, and a couple other folks as well. So it was a very diverse commodity leader panel. And again, this hearing was on producer perspectives on the state of the farm economy. And it was important that we kind of told our story about what the challenges are facing growers, so that we could underscore the need and justifications for that economic assistance that was enacted back in December, but also how that relates to getting the right farm bill across the finish line this year. And we can't continue to have these just 1-year extensions of the 2018 farm bill. So when we were preparing Keith, like we talked a lot about cost of production and how that has been a challenge for growers, and talked about the increased input costs, talked about inflation, talked about all those pressures that are facing producers in the countryside, and how that relates to the need to get strengthen farm safety net And also, in addition to talking about it in that context, we talked about the need for, in our written testimony, we talked about the need for um, increasing market access around the world so that we can remain competitive on the global stage as well. Since I know in Washington and many of the other wheat producing states, uh, you know, a lot of that wheat that you grow is exported around the world. So that was an important point that we were talking about as well as part of that here. So in this 119th Congress, there are new faces on at the top of the dais for the House and Senate Agriculture Committee. So GT, he's a familiar face. He's been around for a few years now, but and as has Bozeman as well. But he assumed the gavel with the Senate flipping hands from Democrats to Republicans. And we also know that Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow, she retired at the end of the 118th Congress. So my home state senator, Amy Klobuchar, she took over on the Democrat side and assumed the ranking member spot earlier this year when they organized their committee. And also for my home state, but not my home district in Minnesota, Angie Craig, at the end of the last year, I think when we were there for Tri-States, the Democrats, their conference had not yet had their elections. And we know that the former ranking member, David Scott of Georgia, he was still looking to run again, but he was challenged by Angie Craig along with Jim Costa of California. So the three of them were running for the Democrat leader spot, and she won on the first ballot, and then was confirmed by the conference later on in December of last year. So exciting to work with some new faces at the top of the dais, but they are not unfamiliar faces to agriculture, and NAWG knows all these individuals very well, and we've worked with their offices over many years. So getting a little bit closer to Tony's question, so it's just some of the things to kind of like keep an eye out for as we continue to wade in, particularly on Farm Bill related issues. These are just some of the different dynamics that are facing the committee as we think about working on a Farm Bill this year. So as I mentioned earlier, the current status of the Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, that has again been extended through the end of September, the end of the fiscal year. Both committees have already kind of kicked off some Farm Bill related hearings. So, like I mentioned a few moments ago, Keith and other producer leaders were testifying. The House Agriculture Committee held a similar hearing to that earlier this week. They had other professionals, but not producer leaders. And I imagine there may be a producer leader meeting at some point in the future on the House Agriculture Committee, but that's a bit of an unknown. They are looking to have a pretty robust series of hearings this first quarter. So a lot of that is still being mapped out, and these committees are just kind of formally stood up in recent weeks. One of the things that we kind of have to think about is what tact or what pathway forward does Chairman Thompson have? So, is he going to, how much of the Farm Bill that he got out of committee last year is he going to recycle? Is he going to have to, is he going to try to make other changes to make it more bipartisan, or have to toe a harder line with members of his conference? That's just one of the dynamics that he's going to have to grapple with, because the House of Representatives, while it's still a narrow majority, it's a narrower majority, Republican majority than it was in the last Congress. So it will be a challenge for him and Speaker Johnson to get to 218 votes, and that's what you need to, pass something out of the House, because there's a segment of his caucus that isn't very supportive of getting farm bills done. So the logical path forward then is they're not going to get on board, or by getting them on board, you alienate centrist Republicans. The dynamic is then you have to get to overcome that deficit. You're going to have to get some Democratic support. So what does that look like? last year he got 4 Democrats on the committee to vote with him, but there was still a large number that did not vote in support of that bill. So what tweaks will they have to make to it to either get all the Republicans on board or get enough Democrats on board to overcome a far right Freedom Caucus deficit. So that's one of the dynamics in the House. And if we think about the Senate side, from a procedural aspect, you have to get 60 votes to overcome, the filibuster type rule that they have in place there. And so, what compromise will have to be struck to get Bozeman and Klobuchar to bring the Farm Bill together? We saw last year that Bozeman and Stabenow were unable to come to an agreement, which is why you didn't see a bipartisan bill get brought forward, which would have, if it was bipartisan, it would have made it out of the committee, and then its fate would have been indeterminate. But the point is, to get something done in the Senate, you have to, generally speaking, has to be bipartisan if you want to get to 60 votes. Republicans have 53 votes in the Senate. So not you need maybe about 7 more, right? So that's the dynamic that they have to deal with. I think that both of those dynamics in the House and the Senate bode towards trying to get a bipartisan one done, but the appetite also has to be there from leadership in both chambers as well as at the White House to get something moving forward in the right direction. Another and on moving to the economic assistance piece, and this is to get to what Tony's question was, and his question, and I'll read it here, is: do you see economic assistance payments to go out by the 3-month deadline, or will they have to plan for distribution of the economic assistance by a different deadline? I think it's kind of what we're asking here. So when it was enacted at the end of December, and it was December 20, I think it was signed into law on December 21st. I was looking at my calendar. And I think the bill text stated that 90 days was the deadline by which they had to distribute these funds. And those deadlines, while they're part of the bill, sometimes they slide because it does take stuff a little bit longer to get done if it's complicated or if it's a new program. Oftentimes that does slide a little bit. But I would this and let me add a layer to that. And so this, by design, this economic assistance was designed to be fairly straightforward in implementing. However, there are a few things that USDA has to work to implement that might not just be readily available, like something that they can just pull out of an Excel and input it. They might have to be, to a degree, creative. However, from the wheat perspective, those numbers are largely baked in and should be fairly straightforward on implementing. And the way it had been characterized is similar to ERP phase 1. And I'm just using this as an example of how it was communicated to growers. Is back then they sent, I think, pre-filled forms to growers and gave them the opportunity to be like, yeah, that's my acreage, and that formula, yeah, that seems right. Sign it and bring it back, or send it back to the FSA office, and then that just confirms the payment amount. And that's how it's been characterized to me, as how they are looking to implement it. And I imagine that is how they do it as well. When Brooke Rollins was testifying before the Senate Agriculture Committee and I think it was in her opening testimony as well, she indicated, it would be a priority for her to roll this economic assistance out in I can't remember if it was her first 100 days or President Trump's first 100 days. I think it was Trump's first 100 days, despite the way I have it characterized on the slide. So it is a priority for her. And when we see her tomorrow, we'll definitely just stress the importance of getting that out to farmers quickly, because that economic assistance, is needed to help producers throughout the countryside. On with that theme of the economic assistance, like I mentioned, it was $10 billion. This slide characterizes what that anticipated breakdown is by commodity in a whole dollar amount. So about 16% of that $10 billion, or about just over $1.5 billion, will be distributed to wheat growers across the country. About double that amount, or just over double that amount, I guess, is what corn producers will get, and soybeans 25.5 billion, or 26% of that will go to soybeans, and cotton will receive just under $10 billion, the remaining going to other commodities. The last policy related slide that I have talks a little bit about some of NAWG's advocacy and lobbying around tax policy. So as I mentioned towards the beginning of this Zoom, a lot of those Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions that were signed into law in 2017 by President Trump are set to expire towards the end of this year. So one of NAWG's policy priorities for this year is working to maintain and improve that tax policy for producers, and to that effect, NAWG is part of a coalition, which is the Tax Aggies Coalition, and it's a lot of folks like myself here in DC who work for other commodity associations. It includes folks like Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, and a number of other folks in interested parties in production and agriculture. Sent a joint letter outlining some shared principles around what folks would want to see included in a tax package. And so the letter included these 8 different buckets: maintaining stepped up basis, providing state tax relief, making the lower individual tax rates and expanded tax brackets permanent, making 199A qualified business income deduction permanent, maintaining Section 179 expenses, restoring the 100% the bonus depreciation, maintaining 1091 like-kind exchanges, and then maintaining the 20% capital gains tax rate. So a lot of these are all shared priorities across those coalitions. Some are more important to others, but these are kind of where we're all at least singing from the same song sheet and going to talk to offices together around these key points. Another thing I'd mention here is we've had conversations with folks on the Ways and Means Committee to this effect, and have provided like producer perspectives to those offices as they kind of work to start thinking about or start writing about what policy priorities that the Republican conference might have when they draft this tax package. And the last slide that I have, and I'm happy to open it up and stick around for conversations. I was in Tri-States back in November for that meeting, and it's always great to see great to see friendly faces, but also meet new producers and other folks as well. But if you're at Commodity Classic early next month, please do stop by the NAWG booth. We'll have a presence there. We'll be meeting with a handful of folks across the industry. Our national leadership and a good number of staff will be there for those meetings. And if you're interested in agricultural research and funding for wheat-related research, we have a National Wheat Improvement Committee fly-in towards the end of March. So March 26th, or 25th and 26th is when we'll be on Capitol Hill. So I would encourage people to arrive on the 24th if you are interested. But if you are looking for those sort of details, reach out to Katie. She can get you in touch with me, and we can get you set up. And we have usually a group of 15 or so folks who come on that trip. And also, as Farm Bill discussions continue in this new Congress, we'll likely have another fly-in, potentially a multi-commodity fly-in. We'll see how that shapes up, but we will want to be complimentary of any committee action that might arrive, that might happen, so that we can, work with our non-traditional partners on Capitol Hill. I think we have I think your delegation, by and large, and the delegation that represents the major wheat constituencies understand the importance of getting a farm bill done and what it means for agriculture and what the current state of the economy is like. But having these more general fly-ins allows and affords the opportunity to educate that non-traditional agricultural side. So like when we had our multi-commodity, I'll just use this one member office as an example. We met with a congressman from Alaska, and Alaska does not have a lot of traditional production in agriculture, right? Like you have like deadliest catch, you've got a lot of salmon, stuff like that, but not necessarily pro crop production. So it's important to have those conversations with those offices when the time is right, and that's usually after markup at the committee level. And then last, that was our fall board of directors meeting. I think it's the week before you all have a meeting, but November 10th through 14th in Austin, Texas is when we have our next in-person board of directors meeting. With that, I'm happy to open it up for questions or discussion. I really appreciate the opportunity, invitation to join the Emma group today and talk about what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Jake. Does anyone have questions? Just pop on. Me pretty informal.
So Andy threw another question in the chat. This is a great question. How will ARC PLC safety net improvements for wheat, what would that look like in the next farm bill? Or what are we advocating for in the next farm bill? There's a few different things here that we can consider for ARC and PLC. I'm going to just stop sharing this so I can see people if they wanted to come off mute. One of our priorities is just first and foremost increasing the statutory PLC reference price. Right now, that's $5.50 an acre. GT's bill was closer to what we have been advocating for, and that was $6.35 an acre. So looking to make improvements there that can either get to that 635 that we saw in the House A committee pass one, or maybe even improve upon that as well. One of the things that we had been talking to committee staff with is at least making sure that we have parity with cost of production with some of the other major commodities that are grown more commonly in rotation with wheat. So thinking about what that looks like for corn and soy. So that's kind of been like the benchmark and how we've been looking to position that. And that got us closer to it. It didn't meet it. So we think there's still room for improvement. But it was definitely a meaningful increase. And that's kind of how we've been publicly messaging it, right? Is we want to have a meaningful investment in farm safety net. And we talk about it in that context, that's trying to bump up the reference price. Another way that we've been having conversations with the committee is around the effective reference price. So in the 2018 Farm Bill, it included a provision that allows for your reference price in the PLC program to go above its statutory level if the 5-year Olympic average meets certain criteria. So there's a formula that you kind of layer onto this existing formula, but it's capped at 115% of your statutory reference price. So at present, the effective reference price, because I think in this next year, it rises above that 550 for the first time ever, because there's like a 85% factor. So it reduces it. So it typically sits below it, but it's going to rise to $5.56 an acre. But then it'll climb again. And then I think after a couple of years, it will just revert below it. And then your floor again is the statutory. So your floor can rise above it if the effective reference price kicks in, but then that floor is still the statutory reference price. It's 550. One of the improvements that we're looking for with the effective reference price is trying to make it more so it doesn't take as long to kick in, right? This year is the first time that, or I think next year is the first time it will ever kick in if it triggers, right? So the market year average still has to be above, market year average still has to be below the effective or statutory reference price for it to kick in. But trying to find a way to make that more responsive so it doesn't take so long to kick in, right? Because it's a 5-year window that you look at, and it's also an Olympic average, so you throw out a year, and so trying to make that more responsive. So those have been a couple of the key NAWG priorities. But another thing that we've been looking at and having conversations with as well is trying to find ways to move up the deadline so it's not as delayed with getting those payments paid out to producers. Because especially right now with the way that the farm economy is, having wait longer for that liquidity is that's not acceptable. And there should be mechanisms, and they were exploring some of those as well, even as part of the continuing resolution, the disaster assistance / farm bill extension conversations. But unfortunately, none of that ever came into fruition. So there was a few proposals out there to move some deadlines up, or move some payment dates up. Good question. Buddy.
Who else has questions? Must have answered them all, Jake, just in what you shared. Okay, I'll give you a minute to think if you've got some others. I just posted in the chat the survey for today's webinar. And I don't want to shut down any questions. If you have some questions, jump in. But at the same time, if you don't have questions, we can conclude. All right, well, thank you, Jake, and I appreciate everyone for joining us today, and I invite everyone to take part in our in-person remaining animal workshops, which continue next Wednesday, February 19th in Washtenaw at the Lions Building with Farm Service Agency and Natural Resource Conservation Services. And we'll have some important program information for both organizations. Registration's at 9:30, and Sunny's Tavern is providing lunch there. Then on Thursday, the 20th, we'll be hearing from Allison Thompson from the Money Tree and WSU's Dr. Randy Fortenberry about global and regional wheat markets at the Hampton Inn and Garden Springs in Spokane. Then on Friday, the 21st, we'll be holding the repeat of the FSA and NRCS program update at their headquarters in Spokane Valley. And then our final in-person before we get to Wheat College is on Thursday, February 27th, and we'll be holding Healthy Mind, Healthy Farm workshop with Darla Tyler McSherry, again at the Hampton Inn at the Garden Springs in Spokane. And this program will conclude about 2:30, and all workshops begin with registration at 9:30. And then remember, save your calendar, put on your calendar, June 4th, we'll have Wheat Pete Johnson will be joining us again, and we'll be for our Wheat College at the Wheatland Fairgrounds in Ritzville. Please ask you to fill out that survey. Thank you so much. If you have any, and it would ask you to RSVP if you're planning on coming and you haven't yet. I would love to be able to feed you meals, and I'm a good guesser, but sometimes I'm not so good. So if you come hungry, I want to feed you. So let me know you're coming. So thanks again, and also appreciate our sponsors who made this educational series possible. And I will have this recorded. If I get the link, I'll put it in the green sheet today. And if not, I will have it if you want it to share with others, as well as I will post it on green sheet next week, if not today. So with that, thank you, Jake, and thanks everyone who was on it. And we'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's good to be on today.
Thank you.